Buyer beware of the touring agreement. Touring agreements have sounded like God's great gift to the real estate industry, especially after the NAR settlement. I've got some serious hesitations that I think you, as a home buyer, need to be aware of before you sign a touring agreement with any agent. But before we get there, let's just talk about what even is a touring agreement, where does it come from? And before we can even address that, we actually have to talk about another issue, and that's the buyer agency agreement or buyer broker services agreement. So, after the massive lawsuit and subsequent settlement with the National Association of Realtors, the NAR created new rules to help protect consumers. And one of those rules was that all buyer's agents had to have a buyer broker services agreement or buyer's agency agreement in place with their home buying clients before the agent was allowed to open any doors or tour any properties with the client. Now, that buyer's agency agreement covered several important things. One, it would set a term for how long the buyer's agent and client were contractually working together. It would set a geographic area that could be limited to one specific address, or it could be to full states. It would also address whether the agency relationship was exclusive or non-exclusive. Could the buyer be working with other agents simultaneously? And finally, but most importantly, these agreements covered compensation. How much money is the buyer's agent going to receive for the services that they render, and how is that paid? It's typically a percentage-based commission, but is that coming out of the buyer's pocket? Is it coming out of the seller's net? How is that going to be handled? All of those things needed to be addressed up front according to the new rules from NAR. Well, couple months in, after agents and consumers trying to navigate through these new rules, and people were feeling like, hey, there are issues here with these buyer broker services agreements. And they're felt on both the agent side as well as on the home buyer side. Home buyers were feeling like, wow, this is a lot of pressure to have to sign on to a term and compensation structure with an agent that I am just meeting. That's a difficult conversation to have up front. And I don't even know if I like working with this person or if they're really the one that I want to sign on with. And so consumers were pushing back on just saying that, hey, I just want to tour a home. I don't really want to formalize an agreement yet. And of course, buyer's agents were feeling the same thing. And of course, for them too, that's an awkward conversation to have right away about compensation. And it can feel very high pressure of like, hey, I know that you reached out because you just want to see that home, but before I can take you there, we got to talk about the tens of thousands of dollars that you're going to owe me if you want to move forward on it. It's a tough sell. So all of the clever people at the local real estate associations, the subdivisions underneath the National Association of Realtors, in partnership with certain states, came up with this brilliant idea of, well, what if we put into place a touring agreement? A touring agreement comes before a full-on buyer broker services agreement. And what it does is it formalizes the relationship enough that an agent, a buyer's agent, can tour clients through properties. But instead of having to address compensation right away, this touring agreement just says, hey, before you go to contract on a home, you will need to have the conversation about compensation, and you will need to sign one of these buyer's agency agreements, whatever that looks like in your local area. So basically, it did just enough to formalize the relationship and say, hey, we're going to have a conversation about compensation before you officially buy a home. And that sounds like a really great thing, right? It seems like it answers both of the questions. It takes a lot of the pressure off of the consumer right away from having to make a big decision on who they're going to sign an agreement with, makes it a lot easier for buyer's agents to start to have those initial meetings with potential clients. And in a way, it just makes that whole relationship a lot more natural. So what's not to love? Well, Here's the real problem. When we think back to the lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors, one of the main things that the lawsuit was pushing for was a decoupling of commissions. And so, what that means is the traditional way that real estate has been transacted for like the past 40 years is that the seller would be offering to pay both the listing agent's commission and they would have an offer of payment to a buyer's agent. And that was the real issue for the lawsuit, was that one, sellers should not be required to pay a buyer's agent because the buyer's agent doesn't work for the seller. The buyer's agent by default works for the buyer. And so why should a seller have to pay somebody that is working against their best interests? That makes sense, right? And the other issue that seller offered compensation created was that buyers had no say in how much their agent would be getting paid because it was all just determined by the seller. So if the seller was offering 3%, well, that's great for the agent. They get 3%, but well, who's really got to pay for that, right? I mean, the seller is accounting for those funds going to the buyer's agent in the price that they're listing their home for and how much they're wanting to walk away with at the end of the day. So theoretically, if a buyer could negotiate with their buyer's agent to receive only 2% compensation or 1% compensation, well, that extra difference between what they've negotiated with their buyer's agent and what the seller is offering, that extra 1 to 2%, that could be leveraged in a whole bunch of different ways, right? It could make the buyer's offer more competitive compared to other competing offers, or that 2% difference could be leveraged as a savings or a credit toward the home buyer themselves. So that was really at the heart of the lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors. It was just saying that to make a better and more fair experience for consumers, we need to decouple the offer of commissions so that sellers only set their commission with the listing agent and buyers set their commission with the buyer's agent. And the buyer should assume responsibility for paying their agent for the services rendered unless they're able to negotiate into the deal the seller to credit them to help cover the compensation owed to a buyer's agent. So instead of the seller offering it up front, commissions on the buyer agent side were supposed to become negotiable all around. That was the goal because it was supposed to create more competition between agents, between brokerages, and that was supposed to be better for consumers. Well, since these rules have gone into effect August 17th, realtors, brokerages have been relentless and ruthless in trying to find ways around them. And the concern is that these touring agreements are going to be one more way to skirt around the spirit of these new rules and the ultimate goal of decoupling commissions. How? Why do I say that? And how does that work? When buyers have to negotiate the compensation with their agent up front, the way that those agreements are written is that an agent, the maximum amount that they can be compensated is what is agreed to in that buyer agency agreement form. So if they agree to 2% upfront, and then they do somehow come across a house where the seller is offering 5% to a buyer's agent, too bad, so sad for the buyer's agent. Their agreement with their client is for 2% compensation. So that extra 3% now can go to the buyer as a credit from the seller, which is awesome for the consumer in that case, right? But it really is a bummer for the buyer's agent because they feel like, man, I'm leaving 3% on the table. Why would I ever want to do that? Well, with the touring agreements, what those are now allowing to have happen, even if it's somewhat unintentional, is that as the buyer's agent and their client are touring through homes, as the buyer gets more serious about particular homes, it creates an opportunity for the buyer's agent to call the listing agent or the seller and ask, is the seller offering buyer agent compensation? Which it sounds like in 99% of transactions across the US, sellers are still offering to pay buyer's agent compensation. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for this. That's a whole nother video for a whole nother time. Sellers, you shouldn't be doing that. But the reality is that most sellers are still offering some sort of compensation to a buyer's agent. And so these touring agreements now allow the buyer's agent to find out what is being offered before a buyer agency agreement is signed and before an offer is made on that home. So here's how this plays out. Touring agreement is signed. Buyer's agent and buyer go and tour a house. Buyer loves the house. Buyer's agent calls, gets more details about the home, and asks, how much is the seller offering for buyer's agent compensation? And if the seller says, we're offering 5%, then what the buyer's agent does is they go back to their client and say, hey, great news. We can put in an offer, and the seller is offering 5% buyer agent compensation. And funny enough, that's exactly what I charge to work together. So let's sign the agreement with me, 5%. Now, don't worry, you're not going to have to pay anything out of pocket because the seller is already offering to pay that. So we'll just get our buyer agency agreement in place for my 5%. We'll put together an offer saying that the seller's going to pay me the 5%. You're going to get a great deal on this house and da 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 da. Great. Everybody wins, right? No, not exactly. Because again, it goes back to that whole thing. If the buyer's agent and the buyer were in a position where they had to negotiate compensation up front before touring any homes, that buyer they would have been in a much stronger, much better position to negotiate a lower compensation for their agent, to get that agent to agree to 2%, so that the buyer could then leverage that 3% difference in what the seller was offering to their own benefit. Now, maybe the buyer loves their agent and they wanted to, revise the agreement so that they could pay their agent more. But in most cases, that's not what's going to happen. In most cases, the buyer's going to say, sweet, well, I'll take that 3% and use it towards my closing costs or as a purchase price reduction. There's so many ways that buyers could leverage that. So that's my big issue with the touring agreements, is that while they make some practical sense in terms of just the relational dynamics between buyers agents and buyers, they muddy the waters when it comes to compensation. And I think that they bring us back to where we were prior to the settlement, where now buyer's agents are just going to write their buyer agency agreements with their clients for whatever compensation is being offered by a seller. And it's going to reinforce this whole idea that for sellers to be competitive and to have their homes taken seriously on the market, they're going to need to offer some sort of significant buyer agency compensation. Kind of a mess. Obviously, I'm not a fan of the way that these touring agreements create further loopholes, and I'm just not impressed at all by this whole industry. Agents and brokers seem to be looking for and creating loopholes wherever they possibly can. It kind of drives me nuts. And of course, all of this is under the umbrella of you should be a DIY homebuyer. Like, you can skip all of this by just learning how to represent yourself and working directly with sellers or with the listing agent, which is totally your right to do. And that's what so much of the content on this channel is all about. So do be sure to check out some of my other videos that walk you through how to successfully represent yourself without having to hire a costly buyer's agent, so that way, when a seller is offering 5% to a buyer's agent, you can leverage all of that 5% for your savings, for your benefit. What an amazing thing that would be. So do subscribe, leave me a comment with any sort of questions or feedback that you've got for me below. And I will see you in the next one.